cold lake water surged around my ankles as the hull groaned beneath me, each metallic echo vibrating through my chest like a warning I was too shocked to process. The cabin lights flickered against the rising dark, and through the narrow window, I watched the silhouettes of my own family drift farther away, their backs turned as if I were already gone. If you've ever felt the sting of trusting the wrong people, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because moments like this don't come out of nowhere. The smell of gasoline, the taste of fear, the creeping realization that the people I loved most had chosen convenience over my life. It all pressed in at once, thick enough to choke me. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. Let me show you how it all began. The first thing I remember is the cold slap of water against my ankles, creeping higher while I stood in the cabin of that little boat on Lake Briar. It was around 2:15 a.m., and I could still see the outline of my daughter-in-law through the small window as she pulled the latch down from the outside. My son stood behind her, frozen, avoiding my eyes as if pretending not to hear me pounding on the door would erase what they were doing. In that moment, the fear hit me hard, but it was the betrayal that stole my breath. I kept thinking that I must have misunderstood, that no child of mine could stay silent while the water climbed past my shins. The engine had died minutes earlier, leaving nothing but the steady groan of the hull and the dark stretch of the lake around me. I felt the boat tipping, taking on water faster than I could brace myself. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of how a quiet birthday weekend had turned into this silent execution. I kept replaying every sign I had brushed off, every moment I chose trust over suspicion. But I survived that night, and days later, I walked into a room filled with people mourning me. Let me take you back to how all of this began. My 70th birthday should have been a simple, quiet moment, but after losing my husband, I was craving any feeling of being celebrated. That was why I agreed so quickly when Aaron and Lindsay invited me to their lake house in Maple Creek. I remember stepping through the doorway and being greeted by warm lights, the smell of cinnamon cake, and the soft music they knew I liked. It felt thoughtful in a way that made my chest tighten with gratitude. Grief has a way of making even small gestures feel enormous, and I let myself sink into that warmth. The lake house sat right against the water, and the afternoon sun had turned the whole place golden. I watched the reflections dance across the windows, while Lindsay guided me to the best chair, insisting I sit, insisting she would handle everything. At first, it felt sweet, like she wanted me to rest. Aaron hovered too, pulling away plates before I could lift a hand, telling me gently that I shouldn't worry about anything. I told myself they were just trying to make the day easy for me. Still, there were moments when their attentiveness felt a little too sharp, as if I was being nudged into helplessness without realizing it. But when you miss being cared for, you tend to brush off those small tugs of discomfort. I kept reminding myself that it was only a birthday, and they were doing their best to fill the space my husband once held. Looking back, that weekend was the first quiet shift in a much larger plan. And the real trouble began when the celebration spilled into the days that followed, starting with my house. I still remember the exact heaviness in my chest the morning I opened the envelope that had been placed on my kitchen counter in Brookside. At first, I thought it was another bill, something routine, something I could handle with the ease I always had. But when I saw my own address printed beside someone else's name on the deed transfer, my hands went cold. For a long moment, I just stared at it, convinced I was reading it wrong. convinced there had to be a simple explanation. My home was the one thing I had left that felt truly mine after losing my husband, and seeing it legally shifted out of my name felt like having the ground pulled out from under me. I remember Lindsay telling me later that I had asked them to help with paperwork, that I had signed things because I was overwhelmed. She spoke to me in a tone that made me feel fragile, as if she were gently reminding a child of something they should have remembered. Aaron laid out what he called proof of financial mistakes I had supposedly made. Missed payments, strange charges, forgetful slips that didn't look familiar at all. And the worst part was the little jolt of fear that maybe I had forgotten something. Maybe grief had scrambled more than just my heart. I kept flipping through the documents, trying to match their version of me with the woman I knew myself to be. The confusion settled over me like fog, blurring the edges of my confidence. I felt myself shrinking, second-guessing every memory, every decision. It was the first moment I realized how quickly independence can slip away when someone decides you no longer deserve to hold it. And that slow unraveling only got worse from there. The days after discovering the house transfer felt like slipping into someone else's life. I woke one morning and reached for my purse, only to find the hook by the door empty. My phone, which I always kept on the kitchen counter, had been moved somewhere I couldn't seem to locate. When I asked about it, I was met with gentle reminders that I had been misplacing things lately, and that it would be better if they held onto certain items for my own good. Hearing those words felt like being wrapped in a blanket I hadn't asked for, one that tightened every time I tried to move. I kept telling myself that maybe they were just worried, that grief had made me more sensitive, that I was reading malice into simple concern. But each time I tried to make a decision, whether it was checking a bank balance or planning my own meals, I found that the choice had already been made for me. Passwords were changed, accounts were secured, even my car keys disappeared into some unknown drawer. The humiliation was worse than the fear. I had spent years leading a school, guiding staff and students, solving problems before they surfaced. Now I was being treated like someone who couldn't be trusted to manage a grocery list. I felt myself shrinking into a smaller version of who I had always been. And the more I tried to hold on, the more control slipped through my fingers. It was in that shrinking that I first sensed something darker beneath their kindness. Something that made my stomach tighten. I didn't know it yet, but losing my independence was only the beginning of the trap they were setting. I remember stepping onto the boat that morning with a tightness in my stomach I tried to ignore. Aaron and Lindsay had insisted the outing on Lake Briar would clear my mind, that a little sunlight and open water would lift my spirits. Their voices sounded warm enough, but something in their eagerness felt rehearsed, as if they were following a script I hadn't been shown. Still, I followed them aboard, telling myself I was overthinking. That unease didn't always mean danger. Almost immediately, the details started to unsettle me. The life jackets were missing from their usual hooks, and the emergency kit that used to sit in plain sight had been moved. Aaron brushed off my concern with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Lindsay kept offering snacks, fussing over me, her hands trembling slightly each time she adjusted something that didn't need adjusting. They kept exchanging glances, quick, heavy looks that made my skin prickle. As the boat drifted farther from shore, the conversation shifted. They spoke casually about selling my house, not hypothetically, but as if the process had already begun. Then came the mention of assisted living, the kind said with soft sympathy that leaves no room for protest. The final blow was hearing that my insurance beneficiaries had been updated, all for my own good. Of course. Each word landed like a quiet verdict, somewhere between their smiles and the gentle rock of the boat. I understood that my voice no longer mattered. Decisions about my life were being made without me, and I was expected to nod along. By the time I realized just how wrong everything felt, we were already too far out on the water. The shift happened so quietly that at first, I didn't realize anything was wrong. Aaron reached down, turned the key, and the engine gave a soft cough before falling into complete silence. The boat drifted, carried by a slow current that pulled us farther from the houses lining Lake Briar. I looked toward the shoreline, shrinking with every passing second, and felt a cold flutter in my stomach. When I asked what was happening, Aaron didn't answer. He just walked to the storage compartment and pulled out a life vest I had never seen before, one that looked strangely light, almost hollow. That was when the pieces started to fall into place. The missing safety gear, the tension in their smiles, the way Lindsay stood back, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, avoiding my eyes. I felt something inside me crack open. The realization that my own son, the baby I once rocked to sleep, was preparing to let the lake swallow me was a blow sharper than any physical harm could have been. For a moment, terror swallowed everything. But years ago, I had been a lifeguard, and some old instinct surfaced through the fear. I forced myself to breathe, to think. If they were committed to this plan, I needed to make them question whether it would actually work. So I mentioned that my neighbor knew I was out here with them, that I had left documents in my car about the house transfer, that people would start asking questions. I watched uncertainty flicker across Lindsay's face, but it wasn't enough. They backed away, stepping toward the edge of the boat, preparing to leave me with the sabotaged vest. When they finally climbed into the smaller dinghy they had tethered behind us, the hollow weight of the moment hit me. Water began seeping into the hull. As their silhouettes drifted away, I told myself the truth. I was not going to die on that lake. The moment their dinghy disappeared into the dark, something inside me snapped back into focus. Panic wanted to take over, but I pushed it down and told myself to move. The boat was sinking unevenly, water rushing in through a crack along the lower panel. I climbed over the rising pool, feeling along the cabinets until my fingers brushed a small flare pouch wedged behind a loose board. It wasn't much, but it reminded me that forgotten things could save a life. Then I saw it. Aaron's phone, dropped near the base of the steering console, half submerged but still lit. I grabbed it and wiped it dry against my shirt. His code had never changed, not since high school. My hands shook, but the screen unlocked. I called emergency services first, giving clipped information about my location before the signal faded. Then I called my neighbor, leaving a breathless message that I was in danger on Lake Briar. The water climbed past my knees, and I knew staying on the boat meant dying with it. I stripped off the useless vest and reached for a floating cushion drifting loose. The air hit my face as I slid into the lake, cold enough to burn. Every stroke felt like a declaration. I will not let them write the end of my story. I kept my breathing steady the way I had learned years ago, counting silently, forcing my muscles to obey even as exhaustion crept in. The shoreline lights blurred, then sharpened as I pushed toward them with everything I had left. Just when my arms began to give out, I heard the low hum of a rescue boat cutting across the water. A spotlight swept over me, and hands reached down as my body finally surrendered. I let myself collapse, knowing I had made it out alive. I walked into the community hall, still smelling faintly of lake water and hospital antiseptic. And for a moment, the room went silent. Dozens of faces turned toward me. Neighbors, old colleagues, people I had known for years, all gathered around framed photos of me surrounded by candles. The shock hit them in waves, but nothing compared to the look on Aaron's face when he finally lifted his eyes. His mouth fell open, and all the color drained from him. Lila stiffened beside him, her hand tightening around a folded tissue she'd been pretending to cry into. Seeing their staged grief laid out so carefully, flowers, a guest book, soft music, sent a sharp ache through my chest. I had loved them enough to ignore every red flag, and they had stood here accepting sympathy for my death. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stepped forward and said what needed to be said, letting the truth settle over the room like a breaking storm. I told them I had survived. I told them where I had been found, what I remembered, and what had been left behind on that sinking boat. The shift was immediate. Officers who had come to support the family began asking questions. Real questions. Their calm facade cracked as details didn't match timelines they had given. When I handed over the screenshots pulled from Aaron's phone, the tension snapped. I watched the cuffs close around their wrists with a mixture of sorrow and relief. This wasn't triumph in the way people imagine it. It was the quiet reclaiming of a life stolen piece by piece. As they were led out, I stood in the center of the room, steadying myself. I knew this was only the beginning of uncovering something much deeper. I sat in the observation room with a blanket still wrapped around my shoulders, watching Aaron and Lila through the glass as investigators questioned them. Their faces shifted between fear and indignation, but underneath it all, I recognized the same calculation I had seen on that boat. For the first time, I saw them without the haze of love and hope clouding my judgment, and the clarity of it nearly took the air from my lungs. When the detectives came to speak with me, their tone had changed. They laid out documents gathered from the house and from digital records, files showing forged signatures, false medical statements, and quiet transfers from accounts belonging to elderly neighbors who had trusted my family. The pattern widened with every page. It was as if I were looking at a map of wounded lives, each one touched by the same quiet pair who had been circling me for years. What stopped me cold was the mention of my husband. The investigators didn't make accusations, but they noted irregularities in his final insurance changes and unusual activity surrounding his medications. Hearing his name spoken in that context sent a deep, aching tremor through me. I had mourned him, believing his passing was a tragic turn, not a step in someone else's design. As the evidence unfolded, the investigators admitted they were seeing threads that stretched beyond our town, possibly across several states. Similar cases, similar signatures, similar beneficiaries. It was a web far bigger than the betrayal that had shattered my family. I felt disbelief give way to something heavier, something steadier. I realized my survival meant more than reclaiming my life. It meant stepping into the truth, no matter how dark it became. So I squared my shoulders and told them I was ready to help uncover everything tied to this network. I would not turn away now, not after coming this far. I spent the next morning seated in a small conference room at the precinct, surrounded by boxes pulled from a storage unit tied to Aaron and Lila. The investigators let me move through the files at my own pace, and with every folder I opened, I felt myself shedding the last remnants of denial. There were names I recognized from our community, and many more I didn't. people scattered across different counties and even different states. Each file carried a quiet story of someone isolated, manipulated, and stripped of what they had worked their whole lives to build. The deeper I read, the colder the room felt. I found lists of potential prospects, spreadsheets mapping out inheritances, health conditions, and projected timelines. Seeing future targets laid out like inventory filled me with a grief that settled low in my chest. When I reached the section containing message logs from a hidden online forum, the reality of the network sharpened. Their conversations were coded, but unmistakably cruel, trading advice on how to pressure vulnerable adults, how to forge subtle financial authorizations, how to isolate someone just enough that no one would question a sudden change. One thread stopped me entirely. It referenced a completed transition in my town around the time my husband passed. There was no direct proof, but the implication hit me hard enough that I had to steady myself against the table. I realized then that whatever had happened to him, whatever had brought me to that sinking boat, was part of something far larger than personal betrayal, and something inside me shifted. I was done being afraid. I told the investigators I was willing to help with whatever came next, even if it meant stepping into danger again. That led to the plan: an undercover meeting at the marina with one of the network's organizers, using the assumption that I had survived but stayed silent. As evening approached, I prepared myself for that meeting, feeling a steady resolve settle over me. I wasn't walking into this as a victim anymore. I was walking in as someone determined to end the entire operation. When the network's leader was finally taken into custody and the last hearing closed, I felt something inside me unclench for the first time in months. The legal process moved slowly, but each step offered a little more air, a little more light, as if I were reclaiming pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. By the time the final orders were signed, I could feel my independence settling back into my bones. Returning to my home was its own kind of healing. I moved through each room with deliberate care, touching the walls, opening windows, and letting in sunlight that had been missing from my life far too long. I sorted through papers, cleaned out drawers, and rebuilt small routines that reminded me of who I had been before fear crept into my days. I started walking the neighborhood again at sunrise, letting the quiet streets ground me. As I grew steadier, I found myself drawn toward others who had been targeted by similar schemes. I offered what I could: an ear, guidance, a bit of hard-earned clarity. Those conversations gave me purpose, and in them I rediscovered the part of me that had always believed in lifting others. One evening, sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, I felt a deep, quiet peace settle over me. It was the feeling of a life reclaimed, a life I was ready to shape on my own terms. And it led me gently toward what I want to share next. Looking back, I'm still amazed by the distance between the woman trapped on that sinking boat and the woman I am now. I survived more than a plan to take my life. I survived the slow erosion of trust, the breaking of my own certainty, and the weight of learning how deeply I had been deceived. Yet somehow, in the middle of all that pain, I found a way back to myself. What stays with me most is the quiet truth that healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in small choices, in reclaiming space, in letting hope return at its own pace. And if my journey says anything, it is that you are stronger than the moments that try to define you. You deserve safety, clarity, and the freedom to live on your own terms. If any part of my story resonates with you, I hope you'll share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Your voice matters, and someone else may find strength in it. And if this journey meant something to you, I'd be grateful if you liked and shared it so others can find it too.